This is Nacro's new report. We are planning to launch it next week. So this is a sort of preview and a chance to give your feedback. If there's anything alarming or something you don't think is correct, then now's your chance. We haven't quite pressed print yet on the report. So the report is called The Truth About Youth, and it's the challenges and aspirations of young people. So this is this kind of came about because largely what Nacro do when we do campaigning is about the criminal justice system. We have done some campaigning, some lobbying, some policy work on education topics, but we haven't done that for a little while. And what we felt was before we started expanding in this area, we should really speak to young people to find out kind of what was going on in their lives, what their thoughts were, their experiences, and what their problems were. And then from there, we could build solutions that we could work on with them and for them. So we went out to our education centres and to our young person's housing project. So we did a survey and we also did workshops. So we actually went to like Peterborough, Middlesbrough, Chatham, Newcastle, Sheffield, like our nest services in like Essex and Lincolnshire and Nottingham. So we sort of got out there around the country as well as putting this survey out. So we had 245 young people complete the survey. That ended up being just slightly more men, so it was like 129 young men and 91 young women. There were some non-binary people, but it was such a small percentage you couldn't really kind of pull it out as a sort of definitive group. So I feel like we got a good cross-section of people from the survey and also from the discussions that we had. So the results of that is what we're going to talk about now. So what we found was, you kind of hope that each generation will feel like they're going to have a better life than the previous generations, that things will get easier, that things will get better, that their opportunities are greater. But actually, when we spoke to the young people in our services, a lot of them didn't really feel like that. So, 1 in 5 thought their generation, only 1 in 5 thought their generation would have a better life than the previous one. So 30%, so that's nearly a third, told us only a third told us they often or always feel hopeful for the future, and 1 in 10 said they rarely ever or never feel hopeful for the future. So it's kind of a sort of a situation where they don't feel they've got that much to look forward to. They're not hopeful they're gonna have the life that they want or have a better one than the previous generation. What we did find, and this was sort of more the positive side of the report, was that most, like over half, felt quite confident that they were going to secure a job or career that they loved. And when we sort of asked them about kind of what are the important things that you need to succeed at work and at a career, they talked about hard work. So 94% of them reported that, having an education, and that scored much higher than things like having money or the connections that you've got, which I think is a reflection of the messaging they're getting from Nacro in terms of work hard, get your education, get your qualifications, and you can achieve what you want to achieve. So I felt that was quite a sort of positive element of the report. And actually, at the end of the survey, we said, what do you want to do as a career? And they weren't like a YouTube star, professional footballer. They were like really like reasonable, achievable, stable, secure, positive careers, like working in childcare or construction and, like owning my own business, but they were like realistic things that they could do. So I think that showed that, they were getting they were quite grounded and they really understood, how to get where they were going to go and what was important in that. So back to the kind of sort of more depressing sort of element of it. So we found that young people felt quite lonely. So more than a quarter said they usually or always feel lonely. And about the same amount said they rarely or never feel good about themselves. And we found that in this area, young women, the results were a lot worse. And in fact, across the whole of the report and all of the questions we asked, young women had more negative views and more negative experiences than the young men. So that was something we found was quite sad, really. We asked young people about what they did. Did they take part in activities outside of school, college, or work? And a quarter of them said they never did. So they never did anything outside of just work or school or at home. But they did spend a lot of time on social media. 37% said they spend 5 hours or more on social media, and that was higher for young women. And some of that may be about some of the issues they felt around kind of being in their communities. So we also asked them about sort of crime and personal safety. So nearly a quarter said they'd been victims of crime, and that was higher for young women again. So nearly half of young women felt there was more crime in the area that they lived in, and actually only 29% of young men felt like that. They, in other sort of questions that we asked, like over half of young women would avoid areas after dark. Over half of young women don't go out after dark. Nearly half of them are staying home more. They're less likely to hang out with certain people. So it was this kind of narrative of particularly young women, like really kind of restricting their lives, staying in more, not going out, not kind of being in their communities, because there was this element of unsafety. And when we were in the sort of workshops, a lot of the young women said, oh, I'd never go out there, or I'd never do that, or I'd never go out after dark, or they were saying things about not going to the gym anymore because they were worried about people following them, things like that. And kind of they have this fear of their safety alongside a distrust of the police, and this came out very strongly in the workshops. And I was actually surprised that over a third said they trusted the police, because nobody in the workshop said they trusted the police. So there's kind of this narrative of fear and nervousness and worry about crime, and more likely to be victims of crime, but at the same time not trusting the people that are there to protect you from it. And they talked about things like, if you call the police, they come down, they just think you're the problem, they stereotype you, they they talked about stop and search, they talked about excessive use of force, they'd say things like, what's the point, I might as well just sort it out myself. And there was this sort of narrative which came through about like the risk of being seen as a grass versus the risk of not reporting it. So if like the value of something that was stolen was really high, maybe you would take the risk and go to the police. But if it was low, you wouldn't, because you don't want to be seen as a grass. So it was interesting, the sort of negotiations that young people are kind of having to go through. So young people had quite a lot of worries, and their worries, the top one was about their family. With 61% of young people regularly worrying about their family, 58% worrying about money, relationships, health. And again, young women were more worried about those things. They felt overlooked. So we did the survey and went to the workshops before the election, and many of the young people didn't even know there was an election happening. So they just felt very, very disengaged. So only a quarter said they were planning to vote, and like 60% of people generally vote. So that's the general figure you would expect to be voting. And so amongst our cohort, that was like much, much less. Quite high proportions of them just didn't feel like the people that run the country listen to them or talk about the things that matter to them. And that came across very strongly in the discussions we had. They were sort of saying, they're all the same, what have they ever done for us? That kind of messaging. So there's definitely something needs to change on that, because a lot of the policies that politicians are kind of creating really directly affect this group. Alongside, as a sort of like companion piece to the survey, we commissioned a media review of national media coverage on young people, and kind of wanted to see what like the public thought about young people alongside what young people feel about themselves. And we found that articles about young people are twice as likely to be negative than to be positive, and that when they were talking about young people, they were talking about them, and there was very rarely included like any sort of perspective from young people, or quote from them, or case study. So it's very much like talking about them as if they're a problem that needs to be solved, rather than like active members of society that can be involved and have an opinion. We found like sort of myths, stereotypes, framing about young people, and like, you know, being lazy, weak, selfish, you know, snowflake generation. Those sort of messages were really coming through, and it really sort of counteracts with a lot of what we've heard, you know, that they do have these genuine worries, and, you know, they're not selfish, they're worrying about other people, and they're worried about safety rather than being, you know, something that's unsafe. So we heard from young people, we got the information we were looking for. We have pulled together some recommendations of what we think needs to change. They're a bit more complicated than this, but this is the top line. You know, number one is young people have to feel safe in their local areas, and it's on the police to build those relationships with young people and ensure they feel safe, and especially address that issue for young women around that public safety problem. You know, it's important that when you're building policy and you're making decisions about these young people, that you do so thinking about them as the different gender, different race, and have that intersectional lens. So it's not just one policy fits all, that you kind of take into consideration everybody's needs. That there needs to be investment in youth services and youth workers, and that support structure that young people had and really has been decimated in the last few years is built, and that needs to particularly think about the needs of disadvantaged young people, and think about what young women need from those services as well. So it's not just a kind of boxing gym that may not appeal to young women. It might appeal to some young women, but maybe not all. That they actually speak to the young people in those areas and say, what do you want? What would help? What would be useful? And they build it around those needs. And when you talk about engaging young people, and there's been a national youth strategy launched just before we're planning to launch ours, and actually talks about a lot of the issues that we've talked about in the report, which is great. And it talks about engaging young people, but we might want to make it really clear that you have to engage the least already engaged young people, so the most disadvantaged, the most furthest away from power, you know, the young people that won't vote because nobody listens to them, nobody cares about what they have to say. You need to be engaging with those young people and consulting those young people, because those are the ones that really need to be actively involved in these decision-making processes. So the plans for the launch, so we're launching next Thursday. We'll have some social media out throughout the day, so we'll be using the hashtag #TruthAboutYouth. So any of our social media, if you jump on there and kind of reshare and retweet, we're going to go out to the media with the story and try and get some media coverage for that. There we'll be taking those recommendations and planning lobbying around those and influencing and kind of getting those messages out through various different forums. In terms of activities in our centres and services, so what we'll do is, we really think it would be great if you guys wanted to share this with the young people in your centres and your services. So have a presentation you could do with them. It could be a talking point. We've got a poster to kind of give some of the information and to get that conversation started. And then we have a plan for an event in Sheffield, and that'll be in the new year, and that'll be like a stakeholder engagement event. And we're going to sort of work with the centre in Sheffield, sort of bring people in, start these conversations, maybe bring people in from the police, maybe bring people in from the local authority and local politicians, and say, look, this is what young people told us, so how do we solve these problems? And that's something that, once we've done that event in Sheffield, that could be replicated in other places, and we're really happy to work with you on that and share material, share learning, share what worked in Sheffield as the canary down the mine shaft, and do that in your local area and help build those relationships and help build that local support for young people. we'll also print out some of the reports and send them out to you guys in the services that you can kind of show some of the young people and work with them and talk to them about.